They were laughing when the signal came in, and I remember that detail because it changed the way I understood laughter forever. I was seated in my archival chamber on the 209th floor of the Athenaeum station, cataloging the extinction of a minor insectoid species from the Pelleran Reach, when my communication panel lit up with an open-frequency broadcast so raw, so unfiltered, that at first I assumed it was debris interference. It was not. It was humanity. I observe the birth and collapse of civilizations, the treaties signed and broken, the species that rise from their home worlds with grand ambitions, only to fold under the weight of a galaxy that does not care about ambition. The rest were absorbed, forgotten, or erased. So when a species with no faster-than-light capability, no galactic patron, no interstellar infrastructure, and no apparent understanding of basic diplomatic protocol, sent an unencrypted broadcast to every receiver within 400 light-years, I did not panic. I simply opened a new file and began recording, because I knew what was about to happen. They would be humiliated. They would retreat to their little system and nurse their wounds for another century or two. That is what always happens. It had been translated into roughly a dozen Concord languages, most of them badly. The Dreth translation used informal tense, which in their culture is reserved for speaking to children. The Valesi version accidentally employed a poetic meter associated with funeral rites. But the core message was clear enough for everyone to understand. We are sending a ship. It will arrive at your conclave. Expect us. That was all. No formal petition, no request for guidance or escort, no acknowledgement of the 12-step application process that every aspiring species is required to complete before even approaching Concord space. Just a flat declaration, broadcast to the entire galaxy. The reaction was immediate and, I must admit, predictable. He stood at the central podium, his forearms folded in the Dreth posture of contempt, and delivered a speech that lasted 40 minutes. He called humanity the tantrum of an infant species. He pointed out that their fastest experimental vessel could reach approximately 6/10 of light speed, that the Athenaeum was 90 light-years from their home system, and that simple arithmetic meant their ship would take well over a century to arrive. The conclave met every 30 standard cycles. They would miss at least 3 sessions before they even got close. The chamber roared with amusement. I recorded every second of it. The Valesi communion, a species that communicates through complex harmonic vibrations, composed what they called a response poem, and broadcasted on the same open frequency humanity had used. I will not reproduce it here because the Valesi have since requested it be stricken from the record, but the rough translation described humanity as a creature shouting into a canyon, mistaking its own echo for a conversation. It was elegant and cruel, which is essentially the Valesi national character. Even species that typically remained neutral joined in. The Orani Collective, a fungal network intelligence that rarely comments on anything, issued a brief chemical-encoded statement that translated loosely to how amusing it was that mammals still thought individual effort mattered. The Tesserae, who communicate through bioluminescent patterns, flashed a sequence that their ambassador later described as the visual equivalent of a slow, pitying headshake. I catalogued all of it. Every joke, every dismissal, every casual cruelty. That is my function. I do not editorialize. I do not judge. I record. I pulled up everything the Concord had on file about humanity. It was not much. They were a carbon-based bipedal species from a mid-range yellow star system. They had achieved basic spaceflight roughly 3 centuries prior to the broadcast and had established a handful of colonies within their own stellar neighborhood. Their technology was unremarkable. Their biology was fragile. Their lifespans were short, laughably so by Concord standards. The average human lived less than a single thalassic administrative cycle. The file contained a note from a Concord survey vessel that had passed through human space approximately 160 cycles before the broadcast. The surveyor had flagged a single observation that I found peculiar. The note read, "This species has experienced at least 14 near-extinction events within the last 10,000 of their orbital periods, including self-inflicted ones. Despite this, population and technological complexity have increased after each event. Recommend monitoring." Recommend monitoring. 2 words buried in a file that no one had opened in over a century. I read them 3 times. The analyst noted something curious. Human languages contained an unusual number of words and phrases related to the concept of endurance. Not strength, not speed, not intelligence. Endurance. The ability to absorb damage, to continue when continuation seemed irrational, to keep moving forward for no reason other than the refusal to stop. I closed the file and sat in silence for a long time. 3 days after the broadcast, I was attending a minor trade negotiation on the lower concourse of the Athenaeum when I encountered a human for the first time. She was a trade liaison named Lucy Brennan, stationed at a small human outpost on one of the border systems. She was short by the standards of most Concord species. Her hair was an unusual reddish color. She spoke passable thalassic with a heavy accent. I asked her, because I could not help myself, whether she had heard her species' announcement. She smiled. It was not a defensive smile, not the expression of a creature that knows it has embarrassed itself. If she understood that the ship her people were building, or had already built, would not arrive at the Athenaeum within her lifetime, or the lifetime of anyone currently alive on her home world. She said she understood perfectly. I asked her why, then. Why send a ship that the senders would never see arrive? Why make a promise that the promisers could never keep? She looked at me with those small, round, oddly expressive eyes that humans have, and she said something that I have carried with me every day since. She said, "The people who planted the oldest trees on our world never sat in their shade. That is not a tragedy. That is the point." But something in the way she said it, something in the calm certainty of her voice, lodged in my mind like a splinter. I asked her one more question. I asked if it bothered her that the entire galaxy was laughing at her species. Lucy Brennan finished her drink, set the glass down on the counter, and stood up to leave. Just before she walked away, she looked back at me and said, "Let them laugh. We have been laughed at before." I returned to my chamber and added her words to the record. Then I flagged the human file for ongoing observation. Something in the archivist's instinct that develops over centuries of sorting the consequential from the trivial, the noise from the signal. That night, I pulled up the navigational charts and plotted the trajectory that a ship leaving human space at 6/10 light speed would follow to reach the Athenaeum. The line stretched across my display like a thread, thin and impossibly long, cutting through empty space, through dust clouds, through the gravitational margins of 3 star systems. I stared at that line and tried to imagine what kind of species would look at it and say yes. Yes, we will send our people down that line. They will grow old. They will have children. Those children will grow old and have children of their own. And somewhere, generations from now, the descendants of the people we chose will arrive at the other end, and they will sit down in a chair that we built for them before they were born, and they will say, "We are here." I could not fit that concept into any framework I possessed. Every species I had ever studied operated on a simple principle. If you cannot get there within your own lifetime, you do not go. That is not cowardice. That is basic biological rationality. Resources are finite. Time is finite. You invest where you can see returns. Humanity did not seem to operate on that principle. Humanity seemed to operate on a principle I had never encountered in 347 cycles of archival work. They invested in futures they would never see, and they did it not out of ignorance or desperation, but out of something deliberate and chosen. Something they clearly valued more than the laughter of every civilization in the galaxy. The human version is active. It is aggressive. It is the decision to build a road toward a destination you will never reach, and to build it so well that the people who come after you will be grateful for every stone you laid. A border dispute between the Tesserae and the Orani absorbed everyone's attention for months. A new species from the outer arm, the Julathi, applied for membership through the proper channels and was granted provisional status within a single session. Nobody mentioned humans, but I kept watching. I kept the file open, and late at night, when the Athenaeum was quiet and the observation galleries were empty, I would sometimes pull up the navigational chart and look at that thin line stretching across the dark, and I would think about Lucy Brennan and her trees. The ship had launched. I confirmed that through intercepted communications from human border stations. They had actually done it. A vessel carrying over 2,000 crew members had departed from a construction platform, orbiting their fourth planet, and accelerated out of their system on a heading that pointed directly at the Athenaeum. The galaxy did not notice. The galaxy did not care. I cared. And for reasons I could not fully articulate, that fact frightened me. The decades that followed were, by Concord standards, unremarkable. The Velesi communion entered a prolonged period of cultural renaissance, producing works of harmonic art that were celebrated across 6 sectors. The Tesseri-Orani border dispute resolved itself through a complex territorial exchange that I recorded in 47 separate volumes. The galaxy turned, as it always does. The Julathi, the new species that had joined the conclave through proper channels, proved to be surprisingly adept at interstellar commerce, and their rapid integration demanded extensive documentation. A supernova in the Corellan cluster displaced 3 colony worlds and required a massive humanitarian coordination effort. A rogue artificial intelligence from an extinct species was discovered drifting near the galactic core and had to be carefully deactivated. The galaxy does not pause for curiosities. Humanity, meanwhile, remained exactly where they had been, a minor species occupying a small cluster of colonies around their home star. They traded modestly with the handful of civilizations whose territories bordered their own. They purchased technology where they could, mostly outdated navigation systems, and basic material compositors that the Concord considered several generations obsolete. They sold peculiar things in return. Art, primarily. Human art had a strange quality that some species found appealing and others found deeply unsettling. It was raw in a way that Concord art typically was not. Their music operated on emotional frequencies that the Velesi, despite their mastery of harmonic expression, found difficult to classify. Their visual art was chaotic and technically imperfect, but several Concord collectors began acquiring pieces, the way one might collect unusual geological samples from a primitive world. They also sold food. This, I found, was perhaps the strangest thing about them. Humans had an almost pathological relationship with food. Where most species consumed nutrients for function, humans had elevated the preparation and consumption of food into an elaborate cultural practice involving heat, chemistry, ritual, and an astonishing variety of biological ingredients. A human trade station on the border offered something called a restaurant, and within 5 cycles, it had become one of the most visited establishments in the sector. Species that had been spacefaring for millennia would travel significant distances to consume things that a human had set on fire and covered in plant extracts. I noted all of this in my records, but I filed it under cultural oddities rather than strategic significance. Not aggressively, not in the way that the Dreth intelligence services operated, with covert agents and surveillance networks and encrypted channels. Humans collected information the way water collects in low ground, naturally, quietly, and in quantities that only become apparent when you step back and look at the whole landscape. Their trade liaisons asked questions, endless questions, about Concord supply chains, about diplomatic relationships between species, about the locations of resource deposits and transit corridors, about the histories and grievances of minor species that no one else paid attention to. They asked these questions casually, over meals, during trade negotiations, in the kind of conversation that seems social rather than strategic. And they remembered everything. When I asked why he wanted to know, he shrugged and said he was just curious. He said humans were always curious. He said it like an apology, but his eyes were careful, and I noticed that he recorded my answer on a small device he kept in his pocket. That was also a mistake. My second mistake was not paying closer attention to their probes. These were basic probes, simple machines carrying sensor packages and communication relays. By themselves, they were unremarkable. These probes were appearing in systems that were far beyond the range that a sublight civilization should have been able to reach, even with generous estimates of their launch dates and velocities. I flagged this in a report to the Concord Intelligence Bureau. I included trajectory analyses, timeline calculations, and a formal recommendation for investigation. The response I received was 3 sentences long. It stated that the probes were likely the result of primitive scattershot exploration, that sublight species commonly launched large numbers of unmanned vehicles in random directions as a form of crude surveying, and that the matter did not warrant further attention. I read that response 4 times. Then I pulled up every recorded instance of a sublight species launching exploration probes and compared their distribution patterns to what the humans were doing. The patterns did not match. Scattershot exploration produces a roughly spherical distribution centered on the home system. The human probes were not distributed spherically. They were distributed along specific corridors, concentrated on routes that connected major systems, resource-rich sectors, and strategically significant positions. This was not random exploration. This was reconnaissance. But I did not stop watching. Over the next 15 years, I quietly compiled a secondary archive, an unofficial record that I maintained outside the standard Concord documentation system. I tracked every human probe detection, every trade agreement, every cultural exchange. I monitored their communication networks, which were growing in sophistication at a rate that did not align with the technology they were supposedly purchasing from neighboring species. Their encryption had evolved 3 times in a single decade, each iteration more complex than the last. Their signal routing used a distributed mesh architecture that bore no resemblance to any Concord standard. They also seemed to know things they should not have known. When asked how she knew about it, she smiled and changed the subject. A human diplomat at a minor trade summit accurately predicted the outcome of the Tessari-Orani territorial exchange 18 months before it was finalized. When pressed on the source of his information, he said he had been reading history. I began studying human history in earnest. I accessed everything the Concord had on file and supplemented it with materials I obtained through unofficial channels, intercepted broadcasts, cultural archives traded by border merchants, and a small collection of human books that I purchased from a Velesi collector who had grown bored with them. What I found in those records reshaped my understanding of the species entirely. Humans did not progress the way other species progressed. Most civilizations advance along a relatively smooth curve, each generation building incrementally on the work of the last. They would plateau for extended periods, sometimes centuries, and then something would happen, a catastrophe, a conflict, a convergence of pressures, and they would leap forward with a ferocity that defied explanation. Their most significant technological advances occurred not during periods of stability, but during periods of crisis. They did not innovate because conditions were favorable. They innovated because conditions were desperate. Their history was full of examples. Their earliest computing machines were developed during a global conflict. Their space program began as a strategic competition between rival nations. Their most important medical breakthroughs emerged from plagues and epidemics that reduced their population by significant margins. Every disaster that should have broken them, instead accelerated them. Every collapse became a launchpad. It was attributed to an unnamed leader during a period of great difficulty, and it read, "We do not rise in spite of our suffering. We rise because of it. The fire does not destroy us. It forges us." Then I pulled up the navigational chart and looked at the thin line stretching across the dark, and I thought about what a species like that would do with 87 years inside a sealed vessel hurtling through empty space. I thought about what that kind of pressure, that kind of isolation, that kind of enforced ingenuity would produce. And for the first time, I felt something I had not felt in 3 centuries of archival work. It was faint, almost indistinguishable from background radiation. A mass, large and dense, moving at a fraction of light speed, on a trajectory that pointed directly at the station. The automated systems classified it as a rogue asteroid and logged it for routine monitoring. I requested a deep scan. The request required authorization from the Concord Observation Council, a body that controlled the Athenaeum's most sensitive sensor arrays. I submitted the paperwork, provided my justification, and waited. The request was denied. The council stated that the sensor arrays were reserved for matters of strategic importance and that a rogue asteroid did not qualify. I told her what I suspected. I told her about the probes, the communication networks, the impossible knowledge, the historical pattern. She listened patiently, as the thoracic always do, and then she told me something that I have replayed in my memory more times than I can count. She said, "Valith, you have spent too long in the archives. You are seeing patterns where there is only noise. Humans are a minor species with no faster-than-light capability. Whatever is on that trajectory is not a human vessel, because a human vessel cannot be there. The mathematics do not allow it." I said, "Overseer, what if the mathematics have changed?" She looked at me with an expression that I recognized as pity. Then she dismissed me. I returned to my chamber and opened my unofficial archive. I added Overseer Malith's words to the record, along with my own observation. The mathematics had not changed, but perhaps the humans had changed what was possible within them. It grew stronger, it grew closer, and it was decelerating. Rogue asteroids do not decelerate. And in the silence of those years, I began to understand something about the species I had been studying. I had been wrong to categorize them under cultural oddities. I had been wrong to file their probes under primitive exploration. I had been watching a species that had learned to see in the dark. While the rest of the galaxy moved through space at speeds that bent physics and arrived at destinations within days, the humans had been sitting in the black, in the cold, in the silence between stars, and they had been learning, not just surviving, learning, adapting, becoming something that the galaxy had never encountered before. A species forged by the journey itself. I pulled up Lucy Brennan's words one more time. Let them laugh. We have been laughed at before. And I finally understood the smile she had worn when she said it. It was not defiance. It was not bravado. It was the quiet confidence of someone who knew something that no one else in the room had figured out yet. The humans were not trying to catch up to the galaxy. They were not trying to match our speed, or replicate our technology, or follow the path that every other species had followed. They were doing something else entirely, something so foreign to Concord thinking that we could not even perceive it. They were building their own path, and they had been building it for decades. I closed the file, I turned off my display, and I sat in the dark, listening to the hum of the Athenaeum systems, and I waited for the thing that was coming. Because it was coming. Something was approaching the Athenaeum, something that had crossed 90 light-years of empty space, something that had been traveling for nearly a century, and when it arrived, the galaxy was going to have to reckon with everything it had dismissed and ignored and laughed at. I was afraid, but I was also, for the first time in a very long career, genuinely curious to see what happened next. The day it arrived, I was cataloging a trade agreement between the Orani Collective and a minor aquatic species from the Venthari system. I remember this because the agreement was extraordinarily boring, a 17-page document concerning the exchange rights for a particular strain of bioluminescent algae, and I was struggling to maintain focus. My concentration had been eroding for months. Every time I sat down to work on standard Concord business, my attention drifted to the long-range sensor feeds that I had been monitoring in a private window on my secondary display. The signature had been growing steadily. It was no longer faint. It was no longer ambiguous. Whatever was approaching the Athenaeum was massive. It was artificial, and it was executing a controlled deceleration burn that required a level of engineering precision that most Concord species would have found challenging. The automated classification system had long since abandoned the rogue asteroid designation and replaced it with a question mark, which in the system's limited vocabulary meant it did not know what it was looking at. I knew. I had known for years, but knowing and seeing are different things. The alert came at midday, station time. The Athenaeum's central detection array, the one that the Observation Council had refused to point at the approaching signature, finally picked up the object on its own as it crossed the threshold into near-station space. The array was designed to track incoming vessels for docking coordination, and it was very good at its job. When it identified something on an approach vector that did not match any registered ship, any known species profile, or any recognized propulsion signature in its database, it did what it was programmed to do. It sent an alert to every screen on the station simultaneously. I was looking at the algae trade agreement when my display went white, then red, then filled with data. I stood up so quickly that I knocked my recording tablet off the desk. In the corridor outside my chamber, I could hear voices rising. Not in alarm, not yet, but in confusion. The Athenaeum hosted representatives from over 60 species, and 60 species worth of confusion produces a remarkable volume of sound. I reached the main observation gallery in 4 minutes. It was already crowded. Ambassadors, trade delegates, military attaches, and support staff from across the Concord were pressed against the transparent viewing panels, staring into the dark. I pushed through the crowd until I reached the front, and then I stopped, and I looked, and I understood why the room had gone quiet. The ship was enormous. I need to be precise here, because my role demands precision, and because the inadequacy of words is itself part of the record. The largest vessel typically seen at the Athenaeum was the Dreth Hegemony's diplomatic carrier, a sleek, angular craft roughly 800 meters in length that the Dreth used as a mobile embassy. It was considered impressive by Concord standards. The Velesi arrived in crystalline ships that were smaller but extraordinarily beautiful, their hulls refracting light into prismatic patterns that made them look like floating gemstones. The thalassic vessels were elegant and understated, smooth curves and muted colors, designed to project quiet authority. The human ship looked like none of these things. It looked like something that had been built not to impress but to endure. Its hull was layered in dense, dark armor plating, segmented and riveted in a way that suggested it had been designed for one purpose: to survive. I could see the scars on it even from a distance, pitting from micrometeorite impacts, discoloration from decades of cosmic radiation exposure, scoring marks that traced the paths of dust particles striking the hull at a significant fraction of light speed. Every square meter of that ship's surface told a story of punishment absorbed and withstood. It was not beautiful. It was not graceful. It was not anything that the Concord would have considered aesthetically acceptable for a diplomatic vessel. It looked like it had been beaten by the universe for nearly a century, and it had simply refused to break. The dimensions came through on the sensor feed moments later, and the murmur in the gallery intensified. The ship was over 3 kilometers long. 3 kilometers. That was not a ship by Concord standards. That was a habitat. That was a small city, wrapped in armor, hurtling through the vacuum at speeds that should not have been possible for the species that built it. But the dimensions were not what silenced the room. The energy signature was. The Dreth military attaché, a decorated officer named Commander Vrelis who had spent his career analyzing threat profiles, physically stepped backward. The Velesi ambassador, Elder Sanathi, stopped mid-harmonic and produced a tone I had never heard from a Velesi before. A single sustained note that in their emotional vocabulary corresponds to profound shock. The ship was not running on the fusion pulse drive that humanity had launched with 87 years ago. The energy signature was completely unrecognizable. It did not match any propulsion system in the Concorde's database. It did not match any theoretical model. It did not even operate on principles that the Concorde's sensor systems were designed to detect. The array had to improvise its analysis, cross-referencing the readings against fundamental physical constants to even begin classifying what it was seeing. And the classification it produced, when it finally came through, was a single line of text that I will remember until my consciousness ceases to exist. Propulsion system of unknown origin. No match in Concorde records. Estimated development. In transit. In transit. Somewhere in the 87 years between launch and arrival, inside a sealed vessel crossing the emptiest stretches of interstellar space, the crew of that ship had invented something that the collected civilizations of the Concorde, with their millennia of accumulated knowledge, and their vast research institutions, and their limitless resources, had never seen before. They had used the journey itself as a laboratory. His forearms were rigid at his sides. His facial plates, which in Dreth physiology shift to express emotion, were locked in a configuration I had never seen on a Dreth before. It took me a moment to identify it. It was not anger. It was not contempt. It was recognition. The recognition of a predator encountering something it cannot categorize as either prey or threat. I saw the Velesi delegates clustered together, their crystalline bodies humming at a frequency so low it was almost subsonic. In their culture, that frequency is reserved for moments of historical significance, moments they believe will be remembered for millennia. I saw Overseer Malith standing at the back of the gallery, her hands clasped in front of her, her expression unreadable. She did not look at me. I did not expect her to. And then the broadcast came. The ship's communication system activated, and a signal cut through every channel on the station with a clarity that suggested either very sophisticated targeting or a transmitter powerful enough to overwhelm everything else in the vicinity. The message arrived simultaneously in all 34 Concord languages, and unlike the original broadcast 87 years ago, the translations were flawless. Perfect grammar, perfect syntax, perfect tonal calibration for each species' communication preferences. Whoever had prepared these translations had not just learned the languages, they had mastered them. The message said, "Vessel designation, Uns patience. Requesting formal berth at the conclave of voices. Humanity would like its seat now." The gallery erupted. Not into panic, not into chaos, but into the kind of explosive, overlapping discourse that occurs when 60 species simultaneously realize that their understanding of the galaxy has just fundamentally shifted. The Dreth were demanding threat assessments. The Velesi were composing emergency harmonics. The Orani had retracted into their collective state and were processing at maximum capacity. The Tesseri were flashing bioluminescent patterns so rapidly that the strobe effect was giving several nearby species headaches. Ambassador Korath pushed to the front of the gallery and shouted over the din. His voice, amplified by the natural resonance chambers in his thorax, cut through the noise like a blade. He demanded that the ship be refused entry. He argued that an unregistered vessel of unknown capability approaching the Concord's most important diplomatic installation, without authorization, constituted a threat. He cited 14 different sections of the Athenaeum security protocols. He called for an immediate military response. Several species agreed with him. The Dreth had allies, and those allies were nervous. An unregistered vessel of that size implied resources that no one had accounted for. The word threat was used 47 times in the first 20 minutes of debate. I counted. She moved to the center of the gallery, and she began to sing. Not a poem, not a prepared statement, but a single ascending harmonic line that in the Velesi tradition represents the acknowledgement of something greater than oneself. The gallery slowly quieted as the harmonic filled the space, resonating off the transparent panels, vibrating in the bones and exoskeletons and neural clusters of every species present. When the silence was complete, Elder Sinathy spoke in the common trade language, her voice translated through a device worn at her throat. She said, 87 years ago, I composed a poem mocking this species. I broadcast it on an open frequency so that they would hear it. I described them as a creature shouting into a canyon, mistaking its echo for a conversation. She paused. The gallery waited. I was wrong, she said. They were not shouting into a canyon. They were shouting across one, and now they are standing on the other side. They earned the chair. Give it to them. The silence that followed was the loudest thing I have ever recorded. The debate continued, of course. The Concord does not make decisions quickly, and a matter of this magnitude could not be resolved by a single Velesi elder's endorsement, however dramatic. The formal deliberation lasted 11 days. Factions formed and dissolved. Arguments were presented, rebutted, revised, and presented again. The Dreth pushed for rejection. The Velesi pushed for acceptance. The smaller species, many of whom had their own complicated histories with the Concord's admission process, split in various directions. She said that her species had spent 40 standard cycles navigating the Concord's admission process, that they had been rejected 3 times, that they had been forced to accept a patronage arrangement with the Dreth that had cost them dearly in both resources and sovereignty, and that every step of the process had been designed to remind them that they were small and unimportant. She said that watching the humans bypass the entire system in a single vessel filled her with a feeling she could only describe as recognition. Then she sat down, and the delegates from 6 other minor species began nodding their bioluminescent patterns, shifting their chemical signatures, and tapping their manipulators in their respective gestures of agreement. The Dreth ambassador watched this happening with an expression that I catalogued as concern. He was losing allies. The smaller species were finding something in humanity's approach that resonated with their own frustrated ambitions, and that resonance was more persuasive than any strategic argument he could offer. But during those 11 days, something happened that shifted the balance of the debate in a way that no argument could. The UNS patience sat in orbit around the Athenaeum, silent and patient, its hull scarred and battered, its unknown drive system idling at a barely detectable hum, and it waited. It did not transmit threats. It did not transmit demands. It did not transmit anything at all after the initial docking request. It simply waited. And the longer it waited, the more the Concorde looked at it, and the more the Concorde thought about what kind of species builds a ship like that, names it Patience, sends it across 90 light-years of darkness, and then waits quietly at the door. I recorded a private comment made by Overseer Malith during a recess in the deliberations. She said it to no one in particular, almost to herself. and I do not think she realized I was within hearing range. She said, "They did not name it defiance. They did not name it conquest. They named it patience, and I find that more unsettling than any weapon I have ever catalogued." The Dreth abstained. 3 of their allied species voted against, but the majority carried, and the motion passed. I was assigned to the inspection delegation. When the announcement was made, I felt something I had not experienced in centuries. My hands were shaking. In the hours before the delegation boarded the UN's patients, I reviewed my personal notes one final time. 87 years of observations. 4 decades of ignored reports. A file that had grown from a minor entry to the largest unofficial archive I had ever maintained. I had spent my entire career recording the achievements of species that traveled between stars in days, that commanded technologies capable of reshaping planets, that had built civilizations spanning thousands of worlds. And in all that time, across all those records, I had never encountered anything that frightened me, the way this battered, scarred, impossibly stubborn ship frightened me. We had faster ships. We had better technology. They had simply refused to let distance stop them, and in the process of crossing that distance, in the crucible of that impossible journey, they had become something we did not expect and could not predict. I stood in the delegation line, my recording equipment active, my hands still trembling, and I watched the airlock open. The first breath of air from inside the human ship reached me before anything else. It smelled like soil, like growing things, like rain on warm ground, a scent I recognized only from environmental simulations of biologically active worlds. Then the door opened fully, and a woman stepped forward. She was tall for a human, with dark skin and close-cropped silver hair, and she wore a uniform that was clean but visibly worn, the kind of garment that has been repaired many times and maintained with care rather than replaced. She carried herself with the posture of someone accustomed to authority, and when she looked at the delegation, her expression was calm, measured, and completely unintimidated by the collection of alien species standing before her. I am the captain of the UNS Patience. Welcome aboard. I activated my recorder and stepped across the threshold into the human ship. Behind me, I heard the Dreth military attaché mutter something under his breath in his native language. The rough translation was, "This changes everything." He was, as I would soon discover, entirely correct. What I found instead was something I did not have a classification for. The walls were painted. Not uniformly, not in the sterile tones of an institutional space, but in colors that shifted as we moved deeper into the ship. Warm yellows gave way to soft greens, then to a deep blue that reminded me of the images I had seen of Earth's oceans. Along the ceiling, a lighting system simulated the gradual shift of natural daylight, moving from the warm gold of morning to the cooler white of midday. The effect was subtle but immediate. Within 30 seconds of entering the ship, my nervous system had begun to relax, in a way that it does not relax inside the Athenaeum, which is lit by the flat, unchanging illumination standard across all Concorde installations. Captain Vasquez led us through the ship with the ease of someone walking through their own home, which, I realized with a start, was exactly what this was. She had been born on this ship. Her parents had been born on this ship. Her grandparents had boarded as young crew members 87 years ago, and they had lived, worked, raised families, grown old, and eventually died within these corridors. The delegation consisted of 12 individuals representing 8 species. I walked near the front, my recording equipment capturing everything. Behind me, I could hear the Dreth attaché's heavy footsteps and the low hum of the Valesi delegates' ambient harmonics. We were all silent. The ship itself seemed to demand it. Captain Vasquez took us first to the agricultural decks. When the doors opened, the delegation stopped. Several members made sounds of surprise in their respective languages. The Orani delegate, who communicates through chemical signals, released a burst of something that my translator rendered as astonishment. The agricultural deck was a forest, not a garden, not a greenhouse, not a hydroponic array. A forest. Trees. Real trees, with trunks thicker than my arm span, rose from soil beds that stretched the length of the deck and disappeared into a canopy of green that pressed against the ceiling 10 meters above. Between the trees, smaller plants grew in dense, carefully managed layers. Vines climbed the support columns. Flowers I could not identify produced scents that mingled in the recycled air. The sound of running water came from somewhere deeper inside the green, and as we walked along a path that wound between the trees, I saw a small stream, artificial but flowing, cutting through the soil and feeding into a collection basin that recycled the water back into the irrigation system. Captain Vasquez explained that the ship had launched with a hydroponic system sufficient to sustain 2,000 people. Within the first decade of the voyage, the crew had begun expanding it. They had brought soil samples, seed banks, and microbial cultures from Earth, and over the following decades, they had built this. Not because it was the most efficient way to produce food, but because they understood something about human psychology that most species would not have considered relevant to a deep space mission. Humans need to see things grow. They need contact with living systems. Without it, their mental health deteriorates, their creativity diminishes, and their social cohesion fractures. So they built a forest inside their ship, and they tended it for 87 years. And it sustained them, not just physically, but in ways that went beyond nutrition. The tree was alive, part of a living system that had been carried across 90 light-years of empty space. I thought about the people who had planted it, who had known they would never see it reach full height, who had planted it anyway, because they understood that the people who came after them would need shade. Lucy Brennan's words echoed in my memory. The people who planted the oldest trees never sat in their shade. That is not a tragedy. That is the point. I stood up. My hand was still trembling. The tour continued. Captain Vasquez led us through residential quarters that were small but warmly decorated, each one personalized by its occupants. She showed us communal spaces where crew members gathered for meals, for recreation, for the social rituals that humans practice, with a dedication that borders on compulsive. I saw a room full of musical instruments, handmade from materials available on the ship. I saw a room where children sat in a circle, while an elderly man told them a story, and the children's laughter echoed down the corridor and followed us as we walked. The ship had launched with 2,000 crew members. The current population was over 8,600. Captain Vasquez stated this number without emphasis, as though it were the most natural thing in the galaxy, but the delegation reacted as though she had announced a detonation. 8,600 people, multiple generations, born, raised, educated, and in many cases deceased aboard this vessel. Entire lifetimes had been lived within these corridors. People had fallen in love here. Children had taken their first steps here. Old people had closed their eyes for the last time here, surrounded by the hum of engines and the distant vibration of a ship moving between the stars. This was not a vessel. This was a civilization, a small one, a contained one, but a civilization nonetheless, complete with its own culture, its own traditions, its own accumulated knowledge passed from generation to generation. Captain Vasquez looked at him with an expression that I later learned humans call amusement, and said that the ship's primary defensive capability was its hull, which had been designed to absorb impacts from interstellar debris at relativistic speeds. She pointed out that any material tough enough to survive 87 years of micrometeorite bombardment at a significant fraction of light speed was, by definition, tough enough to resist most conventional weapons. The Dreth attaché did not ask any more questions about defenses. Then Captain Vasquez took us to the research decks, and the nature of the visit changed entirely. The research section of the UNS Patience occupied nearly a quarter of the ship's total volume. It was not an afterthought or a supplementary facility. It was the heart of the vessel. Laboratories, workshops, testing bays, and data processing centers stretched across multiple levels, connected by corridors that hummed with the quiet energy of active work. Even during our tour, crew members moved through the spaces with purpose, carrying equipment, discussing results, running simulations on display panels that lined the walls. Captain Vasquez introduced us to a man named Simon Hartley, who held the title of Chief Research Coordinator. He was in his 60s, with deep lines around his eyes, and the kind of calm, unhurried manner that I have since learned is characteristic of humans who have spent their lives doing focused intellectual work. He explained, with a patience that matched the ship's name, what the crew had accomplished during the 87-year voyage. 17 major scientific breakthroughs. 17. In fields ranging from material science to energy generation, to medical technology, to the fundamental physics of propulsion. The drive system was the most dramatic achievement, but it was not the only one. The crew had developed a new framework for material engineering that allowed them to fabricate structural components with properties that exceeded anything in the Concorde's material science database. They had created medical interventions that had extended the average human lifespan by several decades, a development that had practical implications for a generation ship where the loss of experienced personnel represented a critical vulnerability. They had designed computational systems that operated on principles the Concorde's own information technology specialists would later spend years trying to understand. Simon Hartley explained the methodology behind these achievements, and his explanation was, I believe, the single most important thing I recorded during my entire career as an archivist. He said that the ship's research culture was built on a principle that humanity called necessity as the mother of invention. On the patience, every problem was an opportunity, every constraint was a puzzle, and every failure was data. The crew could not order replacement parts from a supply chain. They could not consult with external experts. They could not wait for someone else to solve their problems. If something broke, they fixed it. If a system was insufficient, they improved it. I asked him about the drive system specifically. How had they gone from a fusion pulse engine to something that the Concorde could not even classify? He walked us to a section of the research deck that was secured behind heavy doors, and he showed us the development history. It was displayed on the walls in a timeline that stretched the length of the corridor, handwritten notes, and printed diagrams, and physical prototypes mounted in chronological order. The original fusion pulse drive had been sufficient to launch the ship and sustain its initial acceleration. But the crew had known, from the very beginning, that it would not be enough. The drive consumed fuel at a rate that would have depleted reserves long before arrival, so the first generation of researchers began looking for alternatives. They failed. The second generation picked up where the first had left off, incorporating the failures into their models, refining the theories, testing new approaches. They also failed, but they failed differently, and their failures pointed toward a theoretical framework that the third generation used as a foundation. The third generation cracked it. 53 years into the voyage, a team led by a physicist named Grace Whitfield, the granddaughter of one of the original propulsion engineers, demonstrated a proof of concept for a drive system that manipulated the interaction between matter and the energy density of vacuum space in a way that no Concorde scientist had ever theorized. It took another 12 years to build a working prototype, and another 8 to scale it to a size that could move the patients. By the time the ship began its deceleration approach to the Athenaeum, it was running on a propulsion system that 3 generations of humans had invented from scratch, in the dark, between the stars. I looked at the timeline on the wall. I looked at the handwritten notes, the diagrams sketched on whatever material was available, the small models built from repurposed components. Each entry was labeled with a name and a date. Some of the early entries had been made by people who were long deceased, their work continued by students who had become teachers, who had trained new students who had finally completed what the first researchers had only imagined. It was, without exaggeration, the most extraordinary record of sustained intellectual achievement I had ever encountered in my career. Not because the individual breakthroughs were necessarily more impressive than those of Concorde species. Some of them were, many were not. But the continuity, the sheer persistence, the willingness to work on a problem for decades knowing that the solution might not arrive within the researcher's lifetime, that was something I had never seen before. Before we left the research section, Simon Hartley took us through a quieter corridor. The lighting here was softer, warmer, and the walls were lined not with technical diagrams but with names. Thousands of names, engraved into metal panels that stretched from floor to ceiling and continued around a gentle curve that I realized formed a complete circle. Each name was accompanied by 2 dates, a birth year and a death year, and a single line of text. I stopped at one. It read, Claire Ashton, followed by 2 dates separated by 61 years, and beneath it, first-generation propulsion engineer. She never saw the drive work. Her equations made it possible. Another read, Henry Lowell, with a span of 74 years, and built the first soil beds. Taught his grandchildren to grow wheat between the stars. Another, Philip Grant, 58 years, and composed the ship's anthem, sang it every morning until the day he stopped singing. "4,000 people who had lived and worked and contributed and passed away during the voyage, whose entire existence had unfolded within the corridors of this ship, who had been born knowing they would never see a sky or feel wind on their faces, and who had chosen to give their lives to a mission whose completion they would never witness. I stood in that corridor for a long time. They had been replaced by something steadier, something I would later identify as resolve. Then Captain Vasquez took us to the navigation bay, and I discovered that everything I had seen so far, the forest, the community, the research, the drive system, was not the real surprise. The navigation bay was a large circular room at the center of the ship's command section. Its primary feature was a holographic display table that projected a three-dimensional map of the local galactic arm. The map was detailed, far more detailed than I would have expected from a species that had spent the last century inside a single vessel. I could see trade routes, resource distributions, gravitational anomalies, and sensor data that covered a volume of space significantly larger than humanity's known sphere of influence. But the detail that stopped me, that stopped every member of the delegation, that produced a silence so complete I could hear my own cardiopulmonary system operating, was the markers on the map. There were 43 of them. 43 blue indicators, each one representing a vessel, each one on a different trajectory, each one at a different point along its journey. Some were deep in interstellar space, decades from their destinations. Some were approaching star systems in the outer arm. 2 had apparently already arrived, their markers resting on systems that the Concorde had catalogued but never considered strategically significant. Captain Vasquez stood beside the display and let us look. The UN's Patience was not the only ship. It had never been the only ship. Humanity had not sent a single vessel to the conclave as a gesture, as a statement, as the tantrum of an infant species. They had launched a fleet. 43 ships, each one a generation vessel, each one carrying thousands of crew members, each one aimed at a different destination across the galactic arm. The Patience was simply the one pointed at the Athenaeum. The others were headed for resource-rich systems, for strategic waypoints, for the territories of species that the Concorde had ignored or marginalized. Humanity had been seeding the galaxy for decades, and no one had noticed. I looked at Captain Vasquez. She was watching the delegation with an expression of calm satisfaction, the look of someone who has been holding a secret for a very long time, and has finally been given permission to share it. I asked her, and my voice sounded strange to me, thin and uncertain, how long this had been planned. She said, since before the broadcast. The broadcast was not an announcement of our intention, it was a distraction. While the galaxy was busy laughing at the one ship we told you about, the other 42 launched quietly from construction platforms scattered across our system. By the time anyone thought to look, they were already too far out to track. The Dreth attaché made a sound that in his species corresponds to an involuntary stress response. The Valesi delegates' harmonics dropped to a frequency I had never heard before, a frequency that their cultural records associate with the recognition of a fundamental shift in the balance of existence. It was the same smile Lucy Brennan had given me in that trade station bar decades ago, the same quiet confidence, the same knowledge of something that the rest of the galaxy had not yet understood. I returned to the Athenaeum carrying more data than I had collected in the previous 50 years of my career combined. My recording equipment had captured everything, every corridor, every laboratory, every face, every word. But the data was not what weighed on me as I crossed the docking bridge back into the station. What weighed on me was the understanding that the data represented the galaxy had changed, and most of the galaxy did not yet know it. I went directly to the conclave chamber. Species that had not attended a full session in decades had sent representatives. The Dreth hegemony had dispatched 3 additional military advisors. The Valesi Communion had sent their most senior harmonic composer, an individual whose presence at any event signaled that the Valesi considered it historically significant. Even the Orani Collective, which typically participated through a single chemical communication terminal, had extended a physical representative, a rare event that occurred perhaps once in a century. I took my place at the archivist station and prepared my report. Rumors had already spread through the station: the size of the ship, the unknown drive system, the trees. When the session was formally opened and I was called to present, I stood, and I delivered my findings in the measured, objective tone that is expected of a senior archivist. I described the ship's dimensions. I described its population. I described the agricultural systems, the research facilities, the medical advances, and the propulsion breakthrough. It went silent. The kind of silence that has weight, that presses against the walls, that makes you aware of your own breathing. I stood in that silence and watched 60 species process the information simultaneously, each one arriving at the same conclusion through different cognitive pathways. 43 ships. 43 generation vessels, scattered across the galactic arm, moving slowly but inexorably toward destinations that had been chosen with strategic precision. Humanity had not asked permission. Humanity had not filed applications. Humanity had not followed the 12-step process. Humanity had looked at the galaxy, done its own calculations, and launched. Ambassador Korath was the first to speak. He stood at his delegation's position, his 4 arms braced against the railing, and he demanded an immediate military response. He argued that the human fleet constituted an undeclared invasion, that the positioning of the vessels suggested strategic encirclement, and that the Concorde's failure to detect the launches represented a catastrophic intelligence failure. He called for the formation of a combined task force to intercept and disable the remaining 42 ships before they reached their destinations. His argument was not without merit. From a purely strategic perspective, the presence of 43 human vessels on approach to systems across the galactic arm was, at minimum, a significant redistribution of demographic and technological resources that the Concorde had not anticipated. At maximum, it was a slow-motion territorial expansion executed without the knowledge or consent of the governing body. But the argument collapsed almost immediately, and it collapsed for a reason that I found deeply instructive about the difference between the Concorde's assumptions and humanity's actual strategy. The Valesi delegate, Elder Sonathi, asked a simple question. She asked whether any of the 43 ships had entered Concorde sovereign space. I checked the map data. None had. Every single vessel was either in unclaimed territory or on approach to systems occupied by species that were not members of the Concorde. Humanity was not invading the Concorde. Humanity was going around it. This produced a second wave of silence, followed by a different kind of alarm. The Dreth had been worried about a direct threat. What they now faced was something more subtle and, in many ways, more challenging. Humanity was not confronting the Concorde. Humanity was building an alternative to it. Over the following weeks, the evidence mounted. 3 of the 43 ships had already made contact with species in the outer arm, civilizations that the Concorde had catalogued but never engaged with meaningfully. These were small, relatively young species, the kind that the Concorde typically classified as pre-integration and left to develop on their own, which in practice meant left to fend for themselves in a galaxy dominated by older and more powerful civilizations. Humanity had reached out to them, not with demands, not with treaties weighted in humanity's favor, not with the kind of patronage arrangements that the Concorde's major powers used to build their spheres of influence. Humanity had offered trade, mutual defense, and knowledge sharing on terms that the Concorde's legal scholars described as remarkably equitable. Reports came in from a species called the Nenth, a silicon-based civilization in the outer arm that had been struggling with a resource shortage for decades. A human generation ship, the Unce Resolve, had arrived in their system and offered to share the material fabrication technology developed during the voyage. In exchange, the Nenth provided the Resolve with raw materials and docking facilities. Within a single standard cycle, the 2 species had established a functioning bilateral relationship that neither the Concorde nor anyone else had facilitated or approved. A similar situation was developing with the Kaeth, a small mammalian species that occupied a single-planet civilization on the edge of Dreth-influenced space. The Kaeth had applied for Concorde membership twice and been rejected both times, the first for insufficient technological development, the second for failing to secure a patron species willing to sponsor their application. A human ship, the Unce Endurance, was on approach to their system. Preliminary communications suggested the humans intended to offer the Kaeth full partnership status in an emerging network of mutual cooperation, a network that operated entirely outside Concorde jurisdiction. The implications were staggering. The Concorde had functioned for millennia as the galaxy's dominant governing body, not because of military supremacy, though several member species maintained formidable military capabilities. But because of infrastructure, the Concord controlled the trade routes, the communication networks, the diplomatic frameworks, and the FTL transit corridors that made interstellar civilization possible. Any species that wanted to participate in galactic society had to do so through the Concord, because the Concord owned the roads. Slower roads, yes. Roads that took decades to travel rather than days. But roads that connected species the Concord had never bothered to connect. Roads that did not require Concord approval to use. Roads that were being laid down by ships full of people who had spent their lives learning to build things from nothing. The debate in the conclave chamber became, for the first time in my memory, genuinely uncertain. The Dreth continued to push for a military response, but their position weakened daily as it became clear that humanity had not technically broken any Concord law. The Velesi argued passionately for diplomatic engagement, proposing a formal alliance that would bring humanity's growing network into alignment with the Concord. Several smaller species, those who had their own complicated and often difficult histories with the Concord's admission process, began to openly express admiration for what humanity was doing. A delegate from the Tesserae, a species that had spent 40 cycles navigating the Concord's bureaucracy before being granted membership, stood in the chamber and said that humanity had accomplished in one generation what the Tesserae had spent centuries begging for: the right to participate in the galaxy on their own terms. Then something even more remarkable happened. The Julathi, the species that had joined the Concord through proper channels decades ago and had since become a model of successful integration, withdrew their support from the Dreth position and issued a formal statement. Their ambassador, a methodical and usually cautious individual, stood at the podium and said that the Julathi had followed every rule, completed every step, satisfied every requirement that the Concord had placed before them, and it had taken them 72 standard cycles. 72 cycles of petitioning, of proving their worth, of demonstrating their value to species that had already decided they were unimportant. And during those 72 cycles, the Julathi had lost opportunities, resources, and standing that they would never recover. The humans, he said, had chosen a different path. They had built their own door. And having watched the Concord debate whether to open it, the Julathi ambassador said he could no longer pretend that the system the humans had bypassed was fair, because it was not. It had never been fair. It had been designed by powerful species to maintain their power, and every species that had come through the proper channels had paid a price for it. The chamber fell silent. No one had ever said that in the conclave before. Everyone had thought it. No one had said it. It took a species from outside the system to make the species inside it admit what the system actually was. After that, the Dreth position collapsed. Not completely, and not gracefully, but it collapsed. I watched all of this unfold from my archivist station, and I recorded every word, every argument, every shift in alliance and opinion. I began with the facts. I documented the timeline, from the original broadcast to the arrival of the patients, from the discovery of the fleet to the emerging network of alliances in the Outer Arm. I included the technical data, the propulsion breakthrough, the material science innovations, the medical advances. I cataloged the diplomatic contacts and trade agreements. I presented everything in the objective, measured format that the Concord's archival standards demanded. The Concord's archival system is designed to preserve facts, not opinions. An archivist's personal perspective is considered irrelevant to the historical record. In 347 cycles of service, I had never once deviated from this standard. But I had also never encountered a species like humanity before, and I believed, with a conviction that surprised me, that the record would be incomplete without an attempt to articulate what I had observed, not as data, but as meaning. I wrote that every advanced species in the Concord had achieved its position through one dominant advantage. The Dreth had their physical resilience and their rigid hierarchical discipline. The Velesi had their harmonic intelligence, which allowed them to process and communicate information at speeds that other species could not match. The Thalassic, my own kind, had our longevity, which gave us the perspective to see patterns across centuries. Their lifespans were short. Their senses were limited. Something that the Concorde did not have a word for. Something that I had been circling around for decades without being able to name. I tried multiple translations and found all of them inadequate. The closest I could come was a compound concept that combined several human words into something approximate. It was the willingness to begin a journey they knew they would not live to finish, combined with the absolute faith that their children would carry it forward. It was the decision to plant a tree whose shade you would never sit in. It was the choice to build a road toward a destination you would never reach, and to build it so well that the people who came after you would be grateful for every stone you laid. The humans had a word for it that captured part of the meaning. They called it legacy, but even that word was insufficient, because the human version of legacy was not passive. It was not simply leaving something behind. It was an active, aggressive, chosen investment in a future that the investor would never see. It was hope with a spine. It was faith with hands. And it had carried them across 90 light-years of darkness in a ship called Patience, and it was now carrying 42 more ships to 42 more destinations, and it was building a network of alliances and partnerships that the Concorde had neither predicted nor prevented, and it was changing the shape of the galaxy while the galaxy was still arguing about whether to take it seriously. I wrote all of this into the record. Then I added my conclusion. The species that could communicate fastest, trade fastest, deploy military assets fastest, held power. And so the Concord had dismissed them, because within the Concord's framework, a species without speed was a species without power. They had demonstrated that patience, persistence, the willingness to endure, and the capacity to build across generations could accomplish what speed could not. They had demonstrated that a species did not need to arrive first. It only needed to arrive, and to bring something worth arriving with. I sealed the record and submitted it to the Concord archives. Then I added one final line, a personal note that I knew would be flagged as a protocol violation, but that I included anyway, because some things are more important than protocol. I wrote, "Let the record reflect that we were warned. They told us they were coming. They told us to expect them. We laughed, because we believed the galaxy was too large for a species so small. We were wrong. The galaxy, it turns out, was exactly the right size for a species too stubborn to stop." After I submitted the record, I did something unusual. I returned to the UNS patients one more time, not as an archivist, not as a member of any official delegation, but as an individual. I wanted to see the memorial corridor again, the one with the 4,000 names. Captain Vasquez granted my request without hesitation. She assigned a young crew member named Sophie Barton to escort me, a woman in her 20s who had been born on the ship and had never set foot on a planet. I asked Sophie, as we walked through the corridors, whether she was afraid. She had spent her entire life inside this vessel, and now it had arrived at its destination, and the galaxy outside was enormous and strange, and filled with species that had spent decades dismissing her people as irrelevant. Was she afraid of what came next? She thought about it for a moment. Then she said something that I have added to the record as a separate entry, because I believe it deserves its own space in the archive. She said, "My grandmother boarded this ship when she was 26 years old. She knew she would never arrive. She knew her children would never arrive. She boarded anyway, because she believed that her grandchildren would arrive, and that when they did, the journey would have made them ready. I am her granddaughter, and I am ready." I stood in the memorial corridor and read the names one more time. I found Sophie's grandmother among them. Her name was Margaret Ellis. The inscription beneath her name read, "Third generation agricultural lead. She grew the first apple tree that bore fruit between the stars." I placed my hand against the wall, against the cold metal, and I felt the hum of the ship's systems through my fingertips, the pulse of a vessel that had been alive for nearly a century, and I understood something that I had not understood before. The Velesi build art, the Orani build networks. But humans build for people they will never meet. They build knowing they will not see the result. They build anyway. And that is why they are here, and why the 42 other ships are still moving, and why the galaxy will have to make room for them whether it wants to or not. I left the patients for the last time, and walked back to my chamber. I sat down and looked out at the stars through the observation panels. Somewhere out there, in the dark between those stars, 42 ships were still moving. Crews were being born, raised, educated. Research was being conducted. Alliances were being formed, trees were being planted. And the galaxy, slowly but surely, was learning what Lucy Brennan had known all along. What every human who had ever boarded one of those ships had known. What every parent who had held a child born between the stars had known. The journey is the point. The destination is a gift you give to people you will never meet. I have served as senior archivist of the Thalassic Concord for 347 cycles, and in that time, I have recorded the rise and fall of civilizations, the birth and death of empires, the expansion and contraction of powers that shaped the galaxy for millennia. None of them frightened me the way humanity frightens me, and none of them earned my respect the way humanity has earned my respect. The record is complete, the file is closed, but the story is not over. Because they are still coming. All 43 of them. And the galaxy will never be the same.